Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us here again for another edition of our virtual program. What are you reading? I am Ryan Tackerby, the Digital Services Librarian for the Genesee District Library, and we are here with a few librarians from across the county to talk about books they've read recently and what they recommended, what they liked, sometimes what they don't like, because not everyone likes every book that they read, but it's fun to talk about them regardless. You can if you want to join us, leave us a comment wherever you're watching this right now, whether that is on Facebook or on YouTube or on our website, and let us know what you've been reading, if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. And check us out in the coming months. You can see all of our programs, both in person and virtual programs, on our website at thegdl.org. And on our program guide, the 19, which you can find at any of our branches. So our theme sort of this month, we had a theme book of like a spooky Halloween theme for October. So maybe that's a good place to start with some of our books. And I'll bring Sherry up here. Sherry, what do you want to talk about first?
Okay, so my Halloweenish type book is Hallows In by Kristen Proby. She's one of my favorite romance authors. I don't think I've talked about her before here. She's got a unique way of writing families, both found and real families, that just is heartwarming. So a couple of years ago, she started writing one paranormal romance a year. It's not her typical fare. And it isn't typically what I read, but because it was her, I picked it up. It is the beginning of a new series. It's about three cousins who happen to be witches in modern day Salem. So, kind of fun with the whole Hocus Pocus 2 coming out to read more about Salem. The first book focuses on Lucy. She's a green witch, meaning she has affinity for plants and she owns an apothecary. The book takes place right before Halloween. And one night, after she wakes up from a nightmare, she sees a man in her yard who just kind of disappears. She runs into him again, and it turns out he is Jonas, who's a warlock. He lives in a cursed village called Hallows End, which is stuck in 1692, and the town's cursed to live the same month over and over again. Jonas actually cast the spell himself without realizing what the repercussions would be, to try and avoid any of the people in the town from being accused of witchcraft, since 1692 is the Salem witch trials. So Jonas can move between modern times and 1692, and since it's a romance, of course, they fall in love. So they're trying to break the curse of the blood moon, which is the curse of this town, while trying to keep the modern day witches safe, because there seems to be an evil entity that kills one modern day witch every Halloween. It's filled with drama, suspense, magic, romance. Even though it's a romance, I would say it's more of a closed door romance. You don't really get a lot of this romantic scenes. It's really more focused on the paranormal mystery type aspect of the book. There is a coven with some of their relatives and friends. It's just kind of a spooky yet heartwarming read for Halloween.
Do the people in the town know they're reliving the same month, or is it like a kind of like a Groundhog's Day situation?
They actually don't.
Okay. That's some kind of neat and fun, and kind of like twist on like the Groundhog's Day. There's so many like movies and things like that now, but it's the idea of like living out a whole month, kind of
The
on
worst
repeat.
part is there's a woman who's pregnant and she keeps reliving birth over and over again.
Oh, that sounds like horror.
that's, that's what makes it the spooky pick for the month, I think. Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. That sounds really neat. All right, Chris, what do you want to talk about first?
Okay, so my spooky selection was actually recommended to me by my page Amy, who works here in Fenton, and it's called The Haunting Season: 8 Ghostly Tales for Long Winter Nights. I read this probably about 3 weeks ago, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to talk about a book for winter nights. What is the matter with me? And then lo and behold, it snowed yesterday, so I guess I'm on target.
Perfect timing.
So, this is a series of short stories by 8 award-winning authors, and they're telling you their spooky thoughts, perfect for cold nights. The stories cover various sinister topics like haunted estates, holiday markets, and other creepy environments. Think Edgar Allan Poe. At least that's what I thought of when I was reading them. So cemeteries, strange sounds, unusual characters, kind of seeing things that might not really be real, but are they real? What's nice about each story is that they're around 30 pages each. So you can read one in a setting, you can gobble them all up at once. You can read one and not come back to the book for a few days later. That's kind of what I liked about it. I kind of read one at a time just to kind of absorb each one for what it is worth, because I'm not really a horror reader, or spooky story reader. Each story does take place in the winter, so expect to be chilled to the bone.
That's a great theme, and something me personally, I was never a big fan of like short story collections, anthologies, but I find like now, more recently in life, when I don't have a lot of time to read things, I've been really enjoying reading things like this. Going back to one of the what are you readings when I read a collection of short stories that I really enjoyed. So this is I think a neat example of that, of a great like kind of horror thing. Especially if you're not someone who is into kind of that sort of genre, maybe this is an easier, way to digest that type of book. So would you recommend this one to people then if they're not into horror, or?
I think so, yeah, because it's also such, there's only 8 stories in there. So if you read one or two and you feel like you've gotten enough out of it, then that's also, you've sampled some things that were different than what you normally read.
Right. And yeah, like you said, the snow, it's a great part of our very powerful advertising for what are you reading. We manipulated the weather to make our books.
Right.
All right, thanks, Chris. Nancy, what do you want to talk about first? Oops, hold on, I have you muted still. Let me unmute you.
I was very sick, and it was my birthday month, and I was supposed to go to Florida, and then Ian happened. And just September, we're just going to write it off. I started the Shadow and Bone series, and I think I talked about it last time we met, last time I was here. I'm plugging away on it, and I absolutely love it. You can watch Shadow and Bone, the first season, on Netflix, and which is why I think there's a renewed interest in it, because the series is a few years old. The second book is Siege and Storm. The third book is Ruin and Rising. So you can finish the story in 3 books. However, there are 2 different duologies that go further into characters, which I have started those, so I'll talk about those maybe next time. And then there's this really cool book called The Language of Thorns, Midnight Tales and Dangerous Magic. And it's kind of like what Chris read. There's maybe 6 or 8 scary stories. They're fairy tales, and they're in the Grimm's fairy tale genre. They're brutal fairy tales, not for kids. And they kind of shadow some of the characters in the Grishaverse. So I really enjoyed that. They don't really name them, but you can equate the characters in the fairy tales to some of the characters in the series. Shadow and Bone it's its own universe. She's a world builder, and she builds the Grishaverse, and Grisha people are born with special powers, much like witches, and they're very persecuted. And there's a king Grisha called the Darkling, and he has the most powers, and he's advocating for the powers to be recognized and the Grisha not to be persecuted. So you would almost think he's a hero, but he's not. He's the worst character in the story as the story progresses. And you've got some young Grisha who have to realize their powers and take leadership. So the character development is wonderful. There's creepiness, there's spookiness, there's monsters, there are heroes, there are villains. It's just a really neat series, and I'm glad they made a series out of it because it kind of brought it to my attention. We've always had it in my library, and I bought the books, and we buy so many books, sometimes we don't know what's in our library. So I'm revisiting that, and it's a really good story. You can go deep into it because, like I said, there are 8 books available. So you can go through all 8 if you'd like.
A pretty strong recommendation. Then I bet we'll keep hearing about it for a few months ahead still as you read the rest.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Nancy. All right, Sherry, what do you want to talk about next?
Next one I want to talk about is Bloomsbury Girls by Natalie Jenner. It's historical fiction, which I realized I hadn't talked about in a while, any historical fiction, because I hadn't really read any historical fiction in a little while. It's by the author of the Jane Austen Society, and a couple of the characters carry over, but I don't think it's very confusing if you haven't read that one. You may be curious and want to go back and revisit it, but it's not really necessary for the story. It takes place in 1950s London after World War II, which is a different time period. A lot of the books are focusing on World War II right now, but this takes place in the aftermath. And it's about Bloomsbury Books. It's been in business in London for over 100 years. But it's about to be shaken up by the 3 women who are pictured on the cover. The bookstore is run by men, even though the women are behind all the great ideas, including the ones that the men turn down. The owner, well, he's not the owner, he's the manager of the bookstore. He has like 51 rules that he expects to be followed. And needless to say, none of them are followed. So the 3 women, Vivian is an aspiring writer. Her fiance died during the war. She wants to shake up the bookstore and be admired for her ideas, not her looks. Grace is the primary breadwinner of her family. Her husband was in the war, and he came home with some mental issues related to his wartime service. He's also become abusive, and she wants to leave her marriage, but she has 2 young sons to think about. And then there's Evie, who is the one who appeared in the author's previous book. She's a Cambridge graduate, and she's been swindled out of a research position and ends up at the bookstore, kind of on a mission for an obscure book written by a woman that could be considered the very first science fiction book. So this book is just an amazing look at the ways women of the 50s were treated in the workplace, sometimes still are today. The author wrote it as a tribute to bookstores, and she called it cross between Mad Men and You've Got Mail. So if you like those 2 and you'd like an interesting mashup of those 2 with some history thrown in, this might be a good one.
That's it. I like that combination of Mad Men and You've Got Mail. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that wasn't that was hers.
Would you say it's accurate? Are you familiar with Mad Men and You've Got Mail?
I looked it up yesterday and I saw that she had written that, and I was like, oh, that is pretty accurate.
All right. Thank you, Sherry. It's good to see another historical fiction one. Yeah, I felt like it had been a while since you've talked about a
It has.
All right. Chris, what do you want to talk about next?
I'm going to talk about The Shell Seekers by Rosamund Pilcher. A little bit of the background on that. This is a patron of mine's favorite book. Almost every time I see her, she's like, you got to read The Shell Seekers. You got to read The Shell Seekers. And I'd always be like, oh man, it's 500 pages. I got to read all these other things. So we went to Hawaii, and I thought, what greater book to take to Hawaii than The Shell Seekers? So 500 pages, going on vacation. This is going to be the book for me. So this book is about Penelope Keeling. She grows up in London and in Cornwall, the child of a painter. They live a bohemian lifestyle that takes place between the 2 world wars. So this is the story basically of Penelope Keeling as she's a young girl until she's an older woman. She marries a soldier and she raises 3 children over this, I think it's about a 40-year period that the book covers. Once she becomes an adult, she discovers that her father's artwork is worth a fortune, and her grown children want to decide for her how to spend it and then tell her how to live her life. So there's a big portion of the story is about how the children are kind of after the money and, how can we get mom to give us the money and that kind of thing. It's billed as a family saga, as the story is presented in chapters by the variety of characters. So you really have to pay attention to the heading to know whose kind of perspective the story is getting told by. So as I mentioned, it's a little over 500 pages. The writing is very good. She's excellent at describing the setting and developing the characters. The book was written in 1987. So keep that in mind also. I didn't think it screamed of the 80s, though. There weren't any 1980s references that kind of jumped out at me. So that was okay. It kind of made it somewhat timeless, but I'll get to that. It was the first time I read it, I think. So parts of it seemed really familiar to me, but in the end, the ending, I don't know. I don't think I read it, but man, 1987, that's a long time ago. It's possible I read it and I didn't have Goodreads around back then to keep track of it for me. So, like I said, it's a great book to take on vacation or to use in a book club. What I think would be fun to talk about in a book club is the role of working women, how they're depicted in the book, and how you could compare and contrast working women as it was depicted in that book from 1987 to working women today. So
that almost seems like it might be a good companion piece with like the Bloomsbury Girls then, which was, written more recently, but in the 50s. And then you have something that's from the 80s covering some similar topics. But was actually written in the 80s. And so that's always kind of neat.
Yeah. And it's actually just coincidental that we both, came upon books at the same time, that kind of have that feature.
Charmin left a comment and said the length of the Shell Seekers has always put them off also. Would you say it's worth it getting in even though it might be a little intimidating for the length?
I think it's worth it for the setting. I really enjoyed the description of kind of the life and the setting. I will say, though, there were several times while I was reading it, she'd talk about, I'm going to put together this food spread or whatever. In my head, I'd be like, okay, yeah. Do you know how much time and effort goes into planning this food spread you're just going to throw out for everybody? and yet, yeah. So some parts seemed a little unrealistic. But to circle back around, I think it's worth the length. Yeah.
All right. Nancy's back. We lost her for a second. We get back to you, Nancy. I want to say Amber left a comment saying, I believe in reference to Shadow and Bone, that they're going to check out the series on Netflix. So that's great.
Yes.
What do you want to talk about next, Nancy?
I listened on an audiobook, Dolly Parton and James Patterson, Run, Rose, Run. While I was sick, I got in a lot of audiobooks. My eyes were too tired to read, so I highly recommend audiobooks. And if you will try those in the car or while you're cleaning or before you go to bed, you can actually get a lot more books in per month. I notice I've got a list of about a dozen books, and I never read that many in a month. So, and also this book was co-written by Dolly Parton, and she reads her part as one of the characters. So that is amazing. I just love her. She's so great, and she's reading her part. So I couldn't get enough of this book. I think I listened to it in 2 days, and it's not really a mystery like James Patterson usually writes, not like a murder mystery. Rose has another name, She's a mystery. Her past is a mystery that kind of unfolds through the book, but she is a gifted songwriter and she plays the guitar. She's on the run and she runs to Nashville and she starts singing. I think she gets a job as a bartender maybe, and then she plays in the bar as much as she can. Kind of picture the Bluebird Cafe where everyone gets their start in Nashville. It's a bar like that. And Dolly Parton owns the bar, so she's seen a little bit. She's already had a long, successful career, and she said, I'm done. So, of course, she's not done, and she comes back out of retirement to help this girl. And there's a love interest. The story progresses pretty quickly, and the writing is simple enough, like all James Patterson books, that you just keep reading chapter after chapter, and before you know it, you're done. So either read it, or I would highly recommend the audio because of Dolly's voice. But it's a really good one. I really enjoyed it.
Two things I want to say really quick is, first, I just noticed this now looking at the picture on the full screen. At the bottom, it mentions of the cover, there's an album of 12 original Dolly Parton songs from the novel. That's kind of an interesting gimmick, sort of. I wonder, did you listen to any of the Dolly Parton songs? Were they in the audiobook?
No, little parts of songs. And actually, it didn't even read that tiny little thing because I didn't have the book in front of me. So I'm sure we probably carry it and you can get it from GDL.
That's interesting.
I'm going to check that out.
Also, I have to, if we're talking about James Patterson really quick, I have to get like one small James Patterson dig in. And I feel like all of his books have the same font for the titles. I feel like he only has one font that he uses, and it's just used on everything. But it works for him. So I guess, he doesn't need to switch it up.
Someone mentioned to me that usually his name appears first on the book covers. And this is the first time that someone else's has appeared first. And of course, we all know Dolly's the queen. So I did not confirm that with my book covers. Maybe I'll stroll out there today and take a look at it. But I could picture her saying my name comes first. I could see that.
I mean, alphabetically, Parton does come before Patterson.
Oh, maybe.
But I don't think that's the case with his other co-writers.
Yeah, I know. I'll have to check that out with the book covers.
Awesome. Thank you, Nancy. All right, Sherry, what is your last book for today?
My last book for today is Maggie Moves On by Lucy Score. I recommended 2 of her independently published books in previous What Are You Reading episodes. I think Riley Thorne and the Dead Guy Next Door, and By a Thread, I think. This is her first traditionally published book, and I was worried that the switch from independent to traditional would mean it wouldn't live up to my expectations of how funny it was. But I'm happy to say that wasn't the case. Another thing to mention is her most recent book, Things We Never Got Over, I think that's the title of it, is all over Book Talk. There's a lot of holds through the library, and it just hit the New York Times bestseller list last week. So I haven't read that one yet, but she's getting really popular. So this book is about Maggie, who flips houses, and she has a successful YouTube channel showcasing the process. She works with her ex-husband, Dean, and she's about to hit 1 million followers. So she ends up in a small town called Kinship, Idaho, refurbishing a historic home. And she has an interesting meeting with Silas, who owns a landscape business, and he's hoping to work on the flip. His dog, who appears on the cover, Kevin, the overweight service dog dropout, rolls in the mud, gets mud everywhere. He accidentally gets into the wrong truck in all of his mud-covered clothes. And it's a really funny meeting between the two. And he's convinced from the get-go that Maggie's the one. She's not so sure. She travels for work. She doesn't have a fixed address. She usually lives in the home she's flipping. And she likes to keep things on the lighter side. So Silas works really hard to convince Maggie to take a chance on him, including using Kevin and his family. And he's got kind of a weird setup with crazy brothers and sisters and two sets of moms and dads. And if you love a romance with humor, her books are always extremely funny. Small town charm, banter, and adorable pets. You're going to want to grab this one. I mean, Kevin alone sells the book because he also becomes a foster dad to several kittens that show up, and they follow this poor little pit bull everywhere. So it's really cute. It's really light. It's really fun. It's just one of those that you will not want to put down.
I always like it when you talk about these books because I feel like they do an excellent job in the cover. Like really, based on your description, I feel like you can. I get the sense of what you tell us from the cover. Like this is a great job representing the style. It's so kind of like grabbing and engaging.
Yeah, they are good covers.
So is she becoming more popular now? Then now that she's
Yes.
switching now to like kind of a more.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the traditional publishing deal. I haven't read Things We Never Got Over, but I see it all the time on Book Talk. It just made the New York Times bestseller list, which is, I would think, really difficult for an independently published book.
Right.
So I think she's, people are picking them up. I mean, they're really fast reads. They're really funny.
That's really exciting then. So that's good for her. We were talking about her here first, so you get the credit here.
You heard it here.
All right, Chris, what do you want to talk about for your last?
My next title is historical fiction also, and it is The Exiles by Christina Baker Klein. This is the story of the convict ships of 1840, which I knew nothing about. So this was great learning experience for me. The convict ships of 1840 is when the people in England, women especially, who were accused and charged with crimes in London, were sentenced first to Newgate Prison there, and then additionally sentenced to serve out their time to travel across the world on a retrofitted slave ship to serve their time in prisons in Australia. It was part of the colonization plan to repopulate Australia. We also meet a young Aboriginal girl who is called a savage, and the British settlers try to civilize her. So this book had a lot of hard bits to read. There was a point in the story that I put the book down and I wasn't really sure I was going to go back to it. It is a story of friendship, though I think the tough reading kind of overpowers the actual friendship aspect of the story. I learned a lot about it, although, like I mentioned, I had to put it down largely because it was very gruesome, very graphically gruesome. In my opinion, the heartbreak and cruelty really kind of what made it a tough read. The characters are well developed. I enjoyed the fact that it was a new part of history to learn. So I had to go outside my comfort zone a lot. But I ultimately give it 5 stars because I think it's a novel well done. I think in today's climate, it's important to know about women's history, things that we might not have learned and known about in the past, and the fact that these women were accused of stealing spoons or getting pregnant when they were unmarried, and then being sentenced to live in this prison and then put on a retrofitted slave ship and carried across the sea to then be imprisoned in Australia is just kind of a wow. It really was a wow factor for me.
What first drew you to this book? Was it because it was something you didn't know anything about beforehand, or how did you first come across it?
So I actually had selected it for our Fenton Fiction Book Club choice for October. And I believe I just picked it initially because it was written by Christina Baker Klein, who we read before. So a lot of times, when I'm selecting books, I'll go, oh, hey, we really liked whatever story by this author. Let's try another one by that author. So, and I didn't, I would have to say that I was a little bit shocked by her graphic writing style in this one. So.
Is that something that wasn't found in her other works before? It was kind of unique to this.
I mean, I've only read the one before, but I don't remember. I don't remember being like, "Oh, I don't want to read any more of this."
Charmin left a comment and said, "I'll be checking this one out. Interesting topic. I had to read 12 Years a Slave in small bits, also because of the tough subject matter." And it sounds like that's very similar to your experience here.
Yeah, that's such a good. I didn't read that book, but I saw the film, and boy, I had to have a box of tissues next to me to get through that movie.
All right. Thanks, Chris. All right, Nancy, what do you want to finish us out on here?
Well, 2 comments that I had while listening to the others. Sherry, I usually run when I see a cover like that. I call it chick lit or rom-com. And being in my 60s, I run from that. It reminds me of Lifetime movies. But I know everybody loves it. And I've been doing a lot of BookTube and watching YouTube book compilations by 20-somethings because I realize I need to provide a lot of that stuff and I need to get the good stuff for the library. So I've been watching a lot of those and they crack me up, the girls, as much as the subject matter. But yeah, I've been trying to get out of my comfort zone and read a little bit of that. And Chris, I would not normally run toward a book like that knowing that it's going to be a tough read because I'm an empath, so it's hard for me to get through that stuff. I love historical novels, historical fiction about the wars, 1 and 2. And after I read one of those, I usually have to switch over to a witchy book or something, fantasy. I prefer fantasy. I prefer delving into a story because I know it's not real. It's hard to read something that she researched heavily and it's probably truth more than fiction. But anyway, this is a novel. It seems like it would be nonfiction. It's called Chevy in the Hole, and it's a love letter to Flint. I read everything I can about Flint. I like Flint stories, nonfiction even. When I saw Chevy in the Hole, I am a former shop worker. I worked 10 years on a line, and then I was 5 years at GM as a supervisor. So Chevy in the Hole is a plant, actually, that has since closed down. So I got excited thinking it was going to be somebody's story about Chevy in the Hole. It's not, actually. I was disappointed in this story. This was an audiobook that I listened to. And it was easier to get through once I didn't care much for the story. I went ahead and finished it because it was a quick read. There's a man who is a Flint native who has substance abuse issues, and he ODs in a Detroit bathroom stall. So he moves back to Flint to be with his family and to go through rehab yet once again. And he meets a woman who's doing the farm to table movement in Flint. And I wanted to check it out and I didn't. The book states that they actually have farmland where Chevy in the Hole was. And I wouldn't doubt this at all because I know there is a big farm to table movement in Flint downtown. And I'm always driving around downtown Flint. A lot of my wanderings and my shopping takes me out and around Flint. So one of these days I'll drive by it and see if it is a farm field. But this is it's a love story to Flint, but these 2 characters meet up and it's a love story to them as well. And they buy an abandoned house in Flint. At one time, you could buy up these properties and get an actual house. It wouldn't be much of a house because the thieves break in and grab the copper and the doors, all the architectural features, anything they can grab and resell. But you can actually get a house on a little lot for a couple grand. So, and a lot of people bought big chunks of neighborhoods, and then they just tore the houses down. So I guess that was thought of as a good opportunity, maybe like back 2008 on up to, I don't know, 2015. But Flint's coming back. We always say that Flint's coming back, Detroit's coming back, but I believe it. And I love the Flint Farmers Market, and there's several events we go to. We do a craft show with Flint Handmade. We go to that, a craft swap downtown Flint, and I enjoy downtown Flint. So I do think it's coming back, and a lot of people are putting effort into it. If you're interested in that, we've got a magazine that all the library branches have called My City, and they highlight what's going on in Flint. It's a pretty interesting magazine. But this book was short. I didn't enjoy it. It was kind of boring. I guess I was disappointed because I thought it would be about shop life, and it wasn't. But it's just a little sliver of a commentary about what's happening in Flint. So if you're interested in that, it's a pretty good read, although it is fiction.
It's always interesting when you get a book and it's not quite what you think it's going to be, or you think, you have some kind of assumptions about it, and it's, or something you want it to be, and it's not. But it does sound pretty interesting, though. I might have to take a look at that as well. In the comments, again, Charmin left another comment saying that my daughter works at U of M library and author is an alumni of U of M Flint.
I did not know that. Oh, that's awesome.
So that's really interesting.
I did not know that. Thank you, Charmin.
Thanks for sharing that with us, Nancy. So before we go, I'll mention one other comment that was left by Carrie. So they said, hi, watching on Facebook Live. I am reading a Hannah Dennison mystery series. So that's interesting. I would say, Carrie, leave us a review in the comments when you finish it. Let us know if you like it or not, and we could read your review on our show next month live. That would be a lot of fun. All right. Does anybody want to say anything before we go? All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for watching and leaving your comments. And thanks to the three of you for being here with me today and making this another successful edition of What Are You Reading? And we'll be back next month in November. And until then, everyone take care and goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.